In the glittering ballroom of the Marlowe Hotel, crystal chandeliers threw down a light as cold as it was beautiful. I am Vivian Ashworth, and I stood near the head table watching my mother, who wore her one good cardigan, faded at the cuffs, and sat rigidly on a gold velvet chair like a sparrow that had wandered into a lake full of swans. This was my son Henry's christening, and the first major event for my husband Bradley since his promotion. The quiet culmination of 3 years I had spent pretending to be an ordinary, humble wife. "Mother, why are you not eating?" My mother-in-law Deborah called out, raising her wine glass with a mocking smile. "Down in your trailer park, I doubt you have seen lobster this big. We would not want to upset your delicate stomach." Laughter rippled through the relatives nearby, and each giggle landed like a needle. My mother flushed and waved her hands, insisting she was too happy watching the children to be hungry. Under the table, Bradley's shoe pressed hard on my foot, and he hissed that I needed to control her before she embarrassed him in front of his partners. I looked at the man I had loved for 3 years and felt something inside me go cold. For his fragile ego, I had hidden my identity as the sole heir to the Ashworth fortune, living in a cramped Queens apartment, wearing thrift store clothes, even inventing a lottery win to explain the money I quietly funneled into his career. I believed my patience would earn a warm, equal home. Instead, it earned only his contempt, now extended to my mother. I poured her tea and told her to rest her voice. Guilty, she rose and moved toward the one empty seat at the head table, hoping only to be closer to the screen playing images of her grandson. Deborah shrieked, snapping that the seat belonged to her nephew and demanding to know who my mother thought she was. Startled, my mother jumped up, spilling tea, apologizing frantically as she tried to scurry back. Bradley's reaction was faster and crueler than his mother's. He strode over and, in front of every stunned guest, kicked the leg of the chair she had just left. The chair toppled with a crash that echoed through the room. My mother, already off balance, went down hard, her forehead striking a metal bracket on the way to the marble floor. Blood began spreading across her skin. The ballroom went silent. "Hicks need to know their place," Bradley spat, telling her to get out before she ruined his son's future. Deborah strutted over triumphantly, telling the horrified guests this was not about hospitality, that the old woman was simply impossible. Something inside me that had been stretched to its limit for 3 years finally snapped. I ran to my mother, pressed a napkin to her wound, and she grabbed my arm, whispering that I should not argue with my mother-in-law, that it was her own fault. I lifted my head and looked at Bradley over her shoulder. There was no remorse on his face, only satisfaction at asserting his dominance. I stood, shielding her behind me, and looked him dead in the eye. "Bradley, I am giving you one chance. Get on your knees and apologize to my mother right now." He laughed as though I had told the joke of the century, mocking me for daring to give him ultimatums when, in his mind, everything I had came from him. I smiled, a smile with no warmth in it, and told him 3 years of living off my money had made him delusional. Then I slapped him across the face with everything I had. The crack echoed off the walls. "That is only the appetizer," I told him, my voice ice cold. "Starting today, every cent you have taken from me, I am making you pay back with interest." Deborah lunged and froze mid-step, paralyzed by the look on my face. I helped my bleeding mother toward the exit, and at the doors I turned back to announce, quite calmly, that every expense for this christening would be charged personally to Bradley Kane. Then I walked out, leaving 3 years of marriage shattered behind a single kicked chair. At the hospital, under fluorescent lights that made everything look pale and unreal, my mother lay stitched and murmuring that I should not be so impulsive, that couples fight and make up. Even now, bleeding and shaken, her only concern was my marriage, and that broke something in me all over again. I sat beside her bed holding her cold hand and had barely promised her that no one would ever hurt her again when the emergency doors burst open and Bradley stormed in with his entire family trailing behind him, my handprint still glowing red on his cheek, demanding I return to the hotel and beg forgiveness from every guest who had watched the scene unfold. His sister Whitney sneered that my mother had gotten what she deserved. Deborah announced eagerly that Bradley's young intern Paige was already 100 times the woman I was, and Bradley did not deny it. Something inside me went strangely light. I pulled out an old phone I had kept to maintain my disguise, called our family estate manager Bennett, and gave 2 directives. Freeze every card connected to Bradley Kane and send our legal team to meet me here, because I was filing for divorce that night. Our attorney Whitfield assured me our ironclad prenup, combined with tonight video evidence, would let me take everything. As we spoke, the hospital television showed Bradley being blocked by hotel security, every one of his cards declining in front of a crowd of gawking guests. The next morning, dressed sharply and moving with total purpose, I drove to Vantage Digital, the company where Bradley had risen from nobody to executive vice president in 3 short years, never once knowing it had been saved from bankruptcy years earlier by a firm I secretly controlled. I walked into the glass boardroom, and every executive at the table turned to stare at the woman they had only ever seen smiling politely beside Bradley at dinner parties. "I am the majority shareholder of this company," I told them plainly, and watched his face travel from confusion to horror as I called an emergency vote, terminated him on the spot, and ordered a full audit that would later uncover thousands of dollars in fraudulent expenses, including a designer handbag he had quietly billed to a client account for his intern. Security dragged a screaming Bradley out of the building he thought he ruled. Paige, once he came crawling to her for comfort, sold every secret he had for a check without hesitation. Deborah tried public hysteria next, staging a sit in outside Ashworth Group headquarters with hand-painted signs calling me a monster. I answered by playing the unedited christening footage on our building billboard, Bradley's shoe connecting with the chair, my mother hitting the marble, Deborah's own voice mocking her roots. The crowd's sympathy flipped into disgust within minutes, and police removed her for disturbing the peace. I reclaimed the Westchester estate that had always legally been mine, and movers stripped it bare while stunned neighbors watched, hauling out everything the Kane family had accumulated at my expense. When Bradley grabbed my wrist demanding to know if 3 years meant nothing, I reminded him where our marriage had been standing when he kicked my mother hard enough to split her forehead open. His sister Whitney tried stealing a bag of my jewelry in the chaos and was arrested for grand larceny before she made it 2 blocks. Deborah, in one final desperate act, orchestrated a plot to grab my mother and use her as leverage. A plan that collapsed the moment security and police tracked them down and brought her home safely. Bradley and his accomplices taken into custody on the spot. Bradley faced serious charges layered on top of the corporate fraud already uncovered, and the evidence was overwhelming enough that his own attorney could barely mount a defense. He was sentenced to decades behind bars. Deborah avoided prison, but found herself with nowhere left to go, her name poisoned across every circle she had clawed her way into, and when she eventually showed up outside my gates asking for shelter, I arranged for her to live out her days in a strictly regulated care facility, technically an act of generosity, though we both understood exactly what kind of consequence it truly was. I moved my mother and my son back into the home I grew up in, overlooking Central Park, and returned to lead the Ashworth Group myself, facing down board members who assumed I would be a decorative figurehead until they quietly learned otherwise. The wound that mattered most to me was my mother's, so I booked that same ballroom where she had been humiliated and threw a gala in her honor, not for business, but simply to declare to the entire city that Helen Ashworth was the most respected woman I knew. I announced a $100 million foundation in her name to fund education and health care for struggling rural communities, dressed her in a gown fit for royalty, and led her to the exact seat at the head table she had once been kicked away from. In front of politicians, executives, and every camera in the room, I knelt before her and told her how sorry I was that I had ever let anyone make her feel small in her own life. And she pulled me into her arms and told me softly that there was nothing left to forgive. I am raising my son surrounded by honesty instead of cruelty, teaching him that real strength is kindness, and that people who choose cruelty always eventually pay for it in the end. On quiet evenings, my mother took up painting by the window. My son grew a little braver every single day, and the life I had once been ashamed to protect finally felt like something worth fighting for out loud. The nightmare that started with one kicked chair in a crowded ballroom forged me into someone far stronger than the woman who once apologized for her own mother's presence in the room. If this story stayed with you until the very end, take a moment to think about the quiet people in your life who deserve more protection than the world gives them. If this journey meant something to you, hit subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because here on The Revenge Tales, we bring you real stories of betrayal, karma, and the moment someone finally takes their power back. And I will see you in the next story. Content mistress spiked my drink, but I swapped it. Her mom drank it and collapsed. Husband panicked and I filed for everything. Welcome back to The Revenge Tales.